I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. I've been a book lover my whole life, so hosting the show is basically as close to a dream job, I think, as I could envision for myself. And today on the show, I'm actually going to be speaking with an author whose book I picked up before Bookends even existed. Sloane Crosley is here to talk about her latest book, a memoir about her journey through grief. Have you ever seen a book whose title piqued your interest so much that you knew you had to read it without even knowing anything about the author or the subject matter? I came across Sloane Crosley's memoir, Grief is for People, in exactly this way. Sloane Crosley, I later learned, is actually best known for her humorous essays. She's written best-selling collections like I Was Told There'd Be Cake and Look Alive Out There, and she's known for the irreverent yet deeply insightful way she looks at and writes about the world. Now, Grief is for People is no different in this respect, but it does take on a much heavier topic than Sloane's previous work. It's a memoir about the death of Sloane's best friend and former colleague, Russell. I read part of Grief is for People over the summer on the beach in Cape Breton, and I found myself both laughing and crying in public because this is a book that's both witty and heartbreaking. Just a brief word of warning for listeners before we get into it. Sloane's friend Russell died by suicide. If this is a topic that's difficult for you to hear about or not something that you feel you're in the headspace to hear about right now, this may not be the conversation for you. Sloane Crosley joined me from a studio in New York City. Hi, Sloane.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thanks so much for joining me. So your memoir, Grief is for People, centers around your friend Russell Perot, who passed away in 2019. When I was doing grief therapy, 6 months ago or so, the very first thing that we did in group was to introduce our people. And so I want you to introduce your person. Tell me a bit about Russell.
Oh, wow. Where to begin? So I met Russell in the early aughts. He was my third boss in book publishing, and I ended up working for him for 10 years. And we worked in the publicity department of vintage books. And I know there's the phrase work wife, work husband, but I think this really transcended that, where he just became my best friend, my mentor, the person I sort of ate every lunch with. I spent time with him on the weekends. When he died, he was 52. He was 12 years older than I was. And he was just sort of this charming, extremely energetic, extremely well-read, puppyish figure. And like a puppy, could sometimes break things and was very inappropriate all the time. But they were such marvelous jokes. How could you be mad? But he was just this sort of, I know people say larger than life character, but if we think about sort of all the aspects of life, you know, your friends, your family, the art you like, the songs you like, he was just very full throttle and a delight to be around.
I love hearing you describe him, and I loved reading your description of him in the book because it made him feel so alive to me. One of the things that's the weirdest about learning about someone in this way after they've passed away is it makes me upset as someone who obviously never knew him that I didn't get to know him. I was like, this seems like he would have been a fun boss to have. I would have enjoyed the inappropriate, perhaps, jokes in the work environment.
Well, I think it depends. I mean, I certainly did. But, you know, regardless of the work environment, it's always tricky, those people where the sun shines very brightly on you when they like you, and it can be a little bit cold in the shadows. So I don't, necessarily think everyone adored him, but honestly, most people did. Mm-hmm. Most people did. And, it's lovely that you feel that way. It's funny, I talk in the book in the very beginning about how there's this real danger almost in a lot of these kind of memoirs when people are speaking about people they've lost, where you want to say, I miss this person, and here's the texture and the topography of how, but you kind of want to avoid saying, hey, you, reader, miss this person as I do, because it's so much laundering of empathy. They're already sort of just working on being on your side, and then they have to get to know this invisible character and take your word for it. So I am delighted when people have the reaction you just had, because it was my hope, but I didn't aim for it.
Yeah, I think it can be very hard to write about somebody who's passed and to do this kind of grief type writing, because it's like you don't want to do a hagiography where you're only sort of saying positive things, but then, how much of the sort of warts and all do you want to put in there? It's like a very delicate balance that I felt like you struck really well in this work. So Russell was the head of publicity at Knopf's vintage paperback division, and you worked with him for about 10 years. You talk in the book about how your working relationship with him began. How did you meet, and what were your first impressions of him?
So it's funny because, I try not to paint a warts and all portrait of him, maybe pimples and freckles and all. And I try to do the same of myself. And one of the more embarrassing things, at least professionally, that I've ever done, he offered me the job working for Vintage. I was 25, and I asked to come in for a second interview. I had the job. I just thought, well, I don't know, I really like the people I'm already working with. And so I came in and I spouted out all these various questions and had a pad of paper with me. And he put his elbows on the desk and he leaned forward and he looked at me and he said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" And I said, "Excuse me?" And he's like, "It's like you've been admitted to Harvard, but first you need a tour of the bathrooms." Because it's such a good publishing house. Mm-hmm. And he said, "I'm not doing this with you." He's like, "Go over to my shelves, close your eyes, and pick one of the books. Go home tonight, read it, and if you don't see the worth in it, you don't understand how you could possibly recommend it to someone and promote it, you don't have to work here." And I think he knew what I didn't. And in the book, the way I say it is that he was at that age where you start realizing that there's a finite number of loves of your life. That it really was sort of like, we're going to be friends. We are each other's kind of person. And so I picked this book out and I went home and again, eyes closed. It was Nora Ephron's Heartburn. And I worked for him for 10 years.
Wow. Sloane, I want to ask about the title, Grief is for People, because I love this title. And before I knew I was ever going to interview you about this book, I saw it in my local bookstore and it just caught my eye from across the room. And I was like, I need to have this. This seems exactly like the kind of thing I need to read right now. What does that title mean to you?
Well, that's lovely. That question has a nice compliment embedded in it. The title really comes from a line in the book, or a really understanding in the book, because the structure of it is as follows. In 2019, on June 27th in the evening, I left my apartment to do a quick errand. That errand was actually a hand x-ray, which is relevant only because I took off all the jewelry I normally wear. And I came home about an hour later, and my apartment was burglarized. Someone had broken in through the bedroom window, and all my jewelry was taken. And then exactly 1 month later, on July 27th, Russell, who we've just been speaking about, walked into a barn on his property and died by suicide. He hanged himself. And so the title comes from this very sharp shift, obviously, where you have something that would have made a hell of a story, and then you have the life and death story that follows it. Mm-hmm. And right after the burglary, I was really upset. I mean, obviously, it's one of these things that seems like a little bit, man, that sucks, but it's just stuff, unless you've had it happen to you. And I know people who are still upset about it, 30, 40, 50 years later. And I thought, gosh, I wish there was a grief group for this, because I feel like, as wonderful as my friends and family are being, I wish there was some sort of, or beyond a therapist, kind of professional help, something I could join. Just for general trauma, there's not really anything like that. And then Russell died, and I was drowning in them, and I realized that as sad as I was, and there's such a connection between the jewelry and Russell, because as I sort of mentioned previously, he loved flea markets. He had sort of treated old things, vintage things, old books, old vases, old ashtrays, as having a kind of spirit and a soul to them. And he was really upset about the burglary. And in this month in between, he was actually trying to help me hunt it down. But it just becomes this sharp difference, where I suppose if the book had a subtitle, it would be, "I'll give you something to cry about," maybe.
Yeah, Yeah, life has a funny way of doing that. It's like you think you have one problem, and then it's like, what if we gave you another, even bigger problem?
What if we get... Oh, and I didn't even say the line. I'm sorry. The line is, grief is for people, not things, no matter how much you love them. And the truth is you can grieve over animals, and also you can grieve over things. It's just the kind of grief that we all know in our society is the grief that we feel over people, the 5 stages, the pain, the anger, especially when there's a suicide involved.
Yeah, I mean, I love this title. And I think what was interesting to me reading the book is what the title ended up being in the context of the book. And I love having that moment where the title shows up in the text of the book. I had a completely different interpretation of what I thought it meant.
I would love to hear your interpretation because it's correct, whatever it is.
Well, and I think that's what's so cool about this is it's like it sends the mind in all sorts of different directions. I had been kind of thinking about it as, you were talking about there's this almost like hierarchy of grief that we have in, I would say North American society, like in Canada and the US, where, grief is for people and there's certain people that you're allowed to grieve for a longer time than others.
Yes.
There's this notion of like, okay, if you lose a parent or a spouse or whatever, like everyone pretty much seems to understand that that's quite bad. But then if it's a friend or, a friend's parent or something you were close with or a coworker or whatever, like, or, it's an animal or you've lost jewelry or your house burns down or whatever, it's like there's sort of this lower level of acceptability of the amount of time that you're able to grieve for that. And so what I thought the title was getting at and what it represents to me is like that grieving is such an important and universal part of the human experience that we all need to kind of sit with rather than running away from it. And I guess like I just think that because of where I am in my life and being very like present in my grief and like doing the grief therapy to talk about my dad who passed away pretty suddenly.
I was about to ask, I'm like, what was the grief group?
No, it was for my dad.
Okay, I'm very sorry. How did your dad die?
He had a brain aneurysm. Yeah.
Oh, gosh,
yeah.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. Yeah, and you're talking about this burglary being so entangled with your experience of grieving just because of the time between the burglary and Russell dying by suicide, the fact that, you mentioned in the book there's this spice cabinet that he had picked out with you at a flea market that was damaged in the burglary, right? And these two things become totally tied together in your mind. I was reading this book, I was like, this is exactly how like my brain got the wires crossed about different things that I was doing around the time that my dad passed away.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it is that. It is a lot about that. I mean, grief is for people, all people, yes. Sure, there's an element of that. And in terms of the wires being crossed, yeah, I mean, I happen to have had this sort of more minor but perfectly traumatic experience that preceded this event that got crossed in with it. I mean, what happened was when I was thinking about Russell's death, which even saying that in the past tense is a joke. I think about it all the time. When I was sort of musing about it in relationship to the burglary and writing, because I'd already started taking notes really for the burglary part, the 5 stages just seemed like a neat, easy way to organize a book and also to upend them. Obviously, I think someone once told me that the 5 stages are meant for the dying person, not for the grieving person, which could explain why we have so much difficulty. It's such a square peg, round hole thing when people think, well, anger, and I don't know, am I experiencing this? And I know they go back and forth and they're not delineated. Now imagine you're the dying person, and it makes the bargaining, the anger, the acceptance, the depression, it all makes so much more sense. They have such a ownership over it that other people do not. But anyway, one of the sections in terms of crossed wires is bargaining. And after the burglary, and after Russell died, I suppose the term that we've learned from Joan Didion is, or has become popularized by Joan Didion, is magical thinking. And I really felt that if I could find some of this jewelry and I could get some of it back without thinking that Russell would reconstitute himself and spin up like a hologram, that I could actually get him back, that I could stop this sort of bleed of loss. It works so well for bargaining. And so that's how the book ended up being structured, because bargaining works so well, because it was this emotional state as well as an actual state where I was trying to get an object back into my possession.
Yeah. So for listeners who maybe have not, they're not deep in the Joan Didion magical thinking lore, but magical thinking, it's like this idea, that you're talking about of this bargaining of, can I like revive the dead or how can I hold on? And the example that Joan Didion uses in the book that I like thought was so evocative is she's like, she doesn't want to get rid of her deceased husband's shoes. Like she can't bring herself
What if he needs them?
What if he needs the shoes? And it's like, you can realize that some of these thoughts are like a little bit delusional, but it's what the brain does. It's like an attempt to kind of insulate. Your brain has to have some sort of insulation to this stuff, because if you felt all of the grief all at once, it would be like when the Nazis' faces melt off in Indiana Jones. Like,
it is protective. Denial is protective. It protects human beings from dealing with too much reality. If it's extended, it becomes really more of an aversion to mortality, which is a little bit less of a condition and more just how people are. I mean, kind of so much of the book it's about sudden death and sudden loss. So anyone who has experienced the concept of walking side by side with someone and then that person just has their batteries taken out. It's about the effect of that as much as it is the mystery of why, so it's any kind of loss like that is really traumatic.
I'm Mattea Roach, and you're listening to Bookends. I'm speaking with Sloane Crosley about her memoir, Grief is for People. So before this book, you were known for these other humorous essays. I was told there would be cake, Look Alive Out There, like, there's some serious stuff in the later essays, I would say, but not anything quite as heavy as like grief and specifically grieving someone who died by suicide. Here, I think you've woven humor in a way that I found very much aligned with kind of how I've dealt with grief in my life. How do you balance those two things, I guess, in your life? And then how do you balance them in your writing? Like, I feel like sometimes it's a weird line to tread of like, this happened to me, but is it okay for me to put this joke in writing and other people are going to read it?
Well, yeah. What is gallows humor and what is universal and what's not? And the thing is, with my more traditional humor essays, hopefully they're mostly the humor of exasperation, the stuck in the middle with you, don't you just hate it when? And people think, oh, yes, I haven't heard it put quite that way, and I relate to that. And every once in a while there's a joke where I think this is for 15 and a half people tops, and I'm just going to put it in a book and hope that the context supports it. It's a little trickier to do that when you worry about possibly offending people. I mean, the thing I always say is that I worry about offending people who know people who've died by suicide or who've been affected by this type of death, and I'm one of them. Mm-hmm. So it's like, if not, who's the expert? If not me.
Yeah.
But, I think about, the sort of hierarchy of loss that we were talking about before. But I also feel like Russell was my North Star, and entertaining people is my other North Star. I've always been really adamant when it comes to personal writing, narrative nonfiction, personal essays, whatever you want to call it, that the cursed vowel I is just a bridge to get you to something universal. It's almost like standing in a house, and instead of admiring the furniture in the house, you're standing on the porch looking out. That's what you should be doing with personal writing. And so Russell was my North Star. Telling the story in a way that I felt like was important and funny was my North Star. And so even the bits of humor are not just because I think they're funny, they're exemplary of a condition that is universal.
There's a lot of things that people say that are well-meaning, or they come from a good place. It comes out of curiosity or comes out of a desire to comfort, that maybe are not always super well received by the grieving person. And one thing that you've written about is you talk about these comments that you get from loved ones and people in your circle asking, particularly because this is a death that happened on purpose, we can say, did you know, or were there signs in the wake of Russell's passing? How did you feel being asked that question? Because it's a loaded one in a way, I feel.
Well, I should say that especially as time has passed, I have come to the understanding that I should have always had, which is that people really do mean well. And I think that for the most part, when people ask that question, if I came up to you and saw that you had a cast on your leg, it would almost be strange if I just said, oh, that sucks, and didn't say, how'd that happen? What were you doing? Were you skiing? Did you, trip on some pool furniture? What happened? Mm-hmm. And so the instinct to ask for a story is strong in most people, as well as the instinct to support and to try to be kind. So I think most people are coming from a good place. But occasionally it can be rubbernecky. It can feel a little bit like, what would it be like if I did know? And how would I know? Some of the questions I'm like are a little bit, the suggestion is that I could have stopped it. That I could have stopped a perfectly cogent 52-year-old man with barely any history of going to therapy and absolutely no history of being on antidepressants and no prior attempts from doing this. But you roll the tape when someone dies like this and think, what did I miss? But I'm not rolling the tape to think so that I could have prevented it. I'm rolling the tape to think, did I not know my friend? Have I misunderstood my relationship with my friend or, my parent, my sister, whomever it is?
Mm-hmm. Part of what you talk about in this book is kind of the aftermath of your grieving, your processing, your reckoning with this. You're looking back for clues, as you said, not to think, could I have prevented this? But how well did I really know this person? Was there stuff that I was missing about him? You started writing this book really soon into your experience of grieving. I believe the first segment of it you mentioned, you're writing this about the burglary just a month after Russell's passing. Mm-hmm. What was it like writing this memoir as you were still very much in the process of doing the work of grieving?
It's a slightly separate pipe, channel, muscle. I think because I am a writer, there is a little bit of a path laid out. And part of that is about the writers I respect. Like you asked me that just now, and this sort of supercut anthology of lines and images just flew into my brain of, Joan Didion saying, take notes, Nora Ephron saying everything is copy. I think of the Laurie Moore short story, which is actually also about having a child with cancer. People like that are the only people here. And so much of that is about taking notes and the difficulty of taking notes while something really true and traumatic is happening. And how do you capture things without putting pressure on yourself and also without eroding the experience? You're supposed to be paying attention. It's supposed to be terrible. But I think whatever gets you through. So I had started writing really a little bit about the burglary. So I had notes about the burglary and the mystery behind it and me trying to solve it on my own, in addition to the cops asking for footage from coffee shops. I mean, I went nuts. But when Russell died, therefore, I had this sort of other, both the experience and then the actual literal notes for something about loss that were already there. And then I say in the book that a lot of people encourage me in a way not to write about it so quickly, just get some sleep, do what you need to do. I'm like, but this is what I need to do because this is who I am. And if I don't do this, it will be like losing him twice. Yeah. So this is happening right away. It was important for me personally to write about it.
Yeah. You mentioned missing Russell's commentary about events that have transpired in the world since he passed away. And you also say in the book that you felt in your writing you'd been playing for this audience of one. You wanted to know his opinion. You dedicated one of your previous books to him.
I know. How many of these things does he want?
Yeah. Well, I was just wondering, do you ever imagine or think about what he would have made of the book as a piece of work, and also just the fact that you did all this in a way for him?
Oh, yeah. I mean, not anymore, but especially when I was on book tour, I now think he'd be proud, and I think he'd really like it, and I think he'd be flattered. But at the time, I was really worried. I mean, I had conversations with his partner and other people in his life. It's not like, they were like, oh, he'd hate it. But honestly, it doesn't matter how close you are. No one knows, obviously, the answer to what he'd feel about it. But the sort of nagging thing I feel is this is someone who was very inclined towards self-erasure, let's say that. And so I wonder if having this much concentrated attention on him it's not like I think he would have just adored it. I mean, I'm a Leo. I would have adored it. But he's not. I worry about that aspect because when I gave him the first book that I dedicated to him, I did it as a surprise. I didn't tell him I was going to do it. I showed him an early edition of the book and gave it to him. We were at dinner. And he said, "Why did you do that?" And I'm like, "Well, I love you." And he's like, "You could have dedicated it to someone else." And I'm like, "Yeah, but I love you." And he's like, "But I didn't do anything." And I'm like, "You did everything. You're why I was able to write. You encouraged me to write. Half the stuff I've read is your taste. You're my best friend. What are you talking about?" But he had this sort of embarrassment. I know that the next day he went into the office after he slept on it and bragged and showed it to everybody and said, look at this, look at this. And he had it propped up on his desk, with the cover folded back and the dedication proudly exposed. And so I hope that I think a similar process would happen with this, where he'd think, "Oh God, really? Me? Don't waste your breath." And then I hope that it would sink in and he'd be like, "Okay, it's good." I hope.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your work and sharing Russell, both in the book and in this interview. I so enjoyed reading it. So I appreciate your time so much.
Thank you for asking such wonderful questions, truly.
What you just heard was my conversation with Sloane Crosley, talking about her memoir, Grief is for People. If you or someone you know is thinking about self-harm, support is available. Text or call 988 from anywhere in Canada, 24 hours a day. Take care of yourself and take care of each other. This episode was produced by Lisa Matthews and our executive producer, Aaron Balser. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk. I also want to thank our tech, Laura Antonelli, and the entire CBC Books team for making this show happen every week. I'm Mattea Roach, and you've been listening to Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.